All right, you should see a message on your screen. You'll need to hit got it to agree to be recorded. So hi and welcome. My name is Helen Dulac. I am the Public Education Manager for the North Texas Municipal Water District. The North Texas Municipal Water District is a water, wastewater, and solid waste service provider. We provide water to over 2 million people in 10 counties in North Texas. Conserving water is very important in North Texas year-round, even in the cooler months, especially if we don't get water or much rain during the summer. This is why NTMWD teamed up with Texas A&M AgriLife on this series of virtual classes to help you have a healthy landscape while using our most precious resource, water, wisely. As a thank you, we're having a garden toolkit giveaway. If you're in the live Zoom session and want to be entered into the drawing, please send me a direct message with your name and email address through the chat feature. One of the people who sends me their name and address will be randomly selected to win the garden toolkit. For more information on the giveaway and all the classes in this series, please visit the website ntmwd.com/classes. The next class in this series is the North Texas Guide to Trees and Shrubs that will be on November 18th with horticulturist Brad Voss. So everyone knows this session is being recorded and it will be posted on the NTMWD YouTube page. Out of respect for our presenter, please keep your mic muted. Your video may be turned off to conserve bandwidth. Our speaker is looking forward to answering your questions, so please type those in the chat. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Becky Bolin. Dr. Bowling is an assistant professor and extension specialist for urban water with Texas A&M AgriLife. She is the AgriLife extension lead for the Urban Water Innovation and Sustainability Hub at the Dallas Center. She works jointly with AgriLife Research and with AgriLife's extensive network of specialists, regional program leaders, and county extension agents to develop and deliver outreach programming and resources to critical audiences on the topic of environmental stewardship, water conservation, and water quality protection for urban landscapes and beyond. We're very fortunate to have Becky with us, so let's get started, and I'll monitor the chat for questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Helen. And thank you guys for joining today. I'm excited to be here and talk a little bit about fall lawn care. So like Helen said, if you have questions as we go through, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to keep an eye on that as we're talking today, and we can try to keep this a little bit more informal today. One of the first things I wanted to start off talking about is, how much you know about lawns. You may or may not know that typically when we're talking about turf grasses, we divide them into kind of two major categories. We have cool season grasses and we have warm season grasses. And if you've moved to Texas from another part of the country, you may be more familiar with our cool season grasses, which include fescues and bluegrasses and ryegrasses and things like that. Here in Texas, typically in many parts of the state, we tend to have better luck growing warm season grasses. This includes things like Bermuda grass, St. Augustine grass, zoysia grass. These grasses are physiologically different from cool season grasses. They evolved differently over time in warmer climates. They use water more efficiently. They have different temperatures, primary temperatures for growth. And so, they're going to have a very different growth habit. So as you can kind of see here from this image that I've shared, our cool season grasses are typically going to have what's called a bimodal growth habit. So they're primarily going to grow in the spring and in the fall when temperatures are between about 55 and 65 degrees. Whereas our warm season grasses are typically going to green up in the spring. They're going to grow hopefully most of the summer, though it kind of depends on how hot and dry it gets here in Texas. And then they'll start to slow down that growth as we get into fall. The primary ambient temperatures to support new shoot growth for warm season grasses typically are going to be between 80 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's kind of the sweet spot for those particular grasses. And so this is important because especially if you're not from Texas or you're less familiar with some of these grasses, or even if you get online and you start Googling, a lot of times we may hear the term winterizing. I get a little hesitant to use that term when we're talking about Texas lawns, because a lot of times when we hear that term and when we look that term up, it pulls up resources that are focused actually on cool season turfgrass lawns up north. And those resources are not particularly applicable to what we do here in Texas with our warm season turfgrass lawns. So one of the first things that I want to emphasize is that now that our temperatures have dropped, we've actually had a very early historic frost already this year. We're going to see a significant decline in the growth of those warm season grasses. They're no longer going to be taking up water or nutrients at the same rate that they normally would during those warmer months. And so this means that we're going to see a shift in our management practices. We're not going to be mowing as much. We should be using a lot less water, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. Less fertilizer. We will have some other things to kind of keep an eye on. So this time of year, we start to get germination and emergence of winter annual weeds. I'll talk about some of those as we go through. We also have a couple of turfgrass diseases that may show up this time of year in the fall, large patch in particular, which is caused by a pathogen called Rhizoctonia solani. That's a pathogen, a disease that can be problematic in particular on St. Augustine and zoysia grass lawns, though any of our warm season species can be susceptible to it. And then eventually our lawns, many of our lawns here in North Texas will go dormant for the winter. And, during that time, we're going to see a total cessation of growth. The metabolism is going to slow down almost completely in those dormant areas. And we should really adjust our management practices to reflect that change. So what I'm going to do today as we go forward is I'm going to hit on some key management practices or behaviors to kind of keep in the back of your mind, consider as we move into these cooler months. The first of these, which is probably the most important of all the ones we're going to talk about today, is that if you have an in-ground sprinkler system or an automated sprinkler system that's running on a timer, that needs to be set to off at this point in the year. We typically only recommend automation of a sprinkler system for about 4 months of the year, and that's going to be during those summer months. And even during that time, of course, we don't want to set it and forget it. As we get into these cooler temperatures, our turf grasses just generally do not need the same level of irrigation. And if we have an automated timer running where it's still irrigating twice per week or more than that in some cases that we'll see with some of our lawns here in North Texas, it can really start to create a lot of problems. So, one of these is that it's going to be an unnecessary expense for you. You're paying for water to go out, and you're potentially also increasing other expenses if that irrigation system gets damaged, which we'll talk about here in a second, or if you're irrigating a lot this time of year, you're going to increase the likelihood of certain turfgrass diseases, potentially cause parts of your turfgrass lawn to die out, and you may not even know that is happening until next spring. And so there's a lot of potential cost associated with overwatering this time of year. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Again, we're wasting water. So here in North Texas, we're not out of the woods yet. Even with some of the rainfall we've gotten recently, I know we're slated to get a little bit more rainfall over the next couple of days. We are still very much at risk of the next year, the next couple of years, us experiencing some pretty severe drought events. And those of you that live, around this area, I live in Plano, I'm in Collin County. You know how much this area is growing and continuing to grow. And the more folks are moving here, the more demand that's putting on a lot of our water resources. And when we combine that with drought events and things like that, it really can start to create some concerns for us. And so we really want to be conscientious about the water that we're using. And probably the most effective way to conserve water in North Texas landscapes is going to be to really monitor what we're doing outdoors. We may see, Helen may have some even more accurate numbers than I do on this, but very often during the summer months, we may see that 50 to 70% of that household household potable water is being used outdoors in lawns and landscapes. And so, that's going to start to drop down. And typically the average across the year is going to be closer to about 30%. But this is definitely something that can be a concern. And so winter is a great time to stop irrigating and use a lot less water. Then we've got, again, if we're watering a lot this time of year, we're increasing the likelihood of disease activity, especially if you're watering in the evening. Tends to prolong the period of leaf wetness. It allows water to stay on turf grass leaves overnight, and this is going to increase the likelihood of disease. Equipment damage is also a possibility. If we happen to get a more extreme frost event, and our irrigation system is operating or has recently operated, we're going to increase the likelihood of damaging components in that system. Also, a couple of years ago, here in Dallas, I'll even tell you guys where it is because y'all are all from up here. So I was over on Hebron and Josie in the kind of Carrollton area on Valentine's Day a couple of years ago, and somebody had run their irrigation system overnight to the point that it had run off and basically flooded the right-hand lane of Hebron Parkway. And we had a frost that night that created kind of an ice situation that people were not prepared for. And we had a 4-vehicle accident in that lane because somebody just had their irrigation system running heavily overnight during a time that they didn't need to. So we really want to make sure that we get that turned off. And Rudy asked a great question. How is perimeter watering for foundation? How will it impact the grass? Will those needs conflict with each other in wintertime? So, I'm always hesitant to provide recommendations for foundation watering. That should really be done by a professional engineer. And I would just caution you guys too, as you look for information about that on the internet, know that it is actually possible to overwater your foundation and cause it to break. And so, what I would look for are trustworthy sources from professional engineers that can provide tips on that. If your priority is to keep your foundation in a good place, I wouldn't worry so much about how that may or may not impact your turf grass. Typically, we'll see that turf grass right up next to the house will stay a little bit more active in the wintertime anyways, because it's a little bit warmer closer to that property and closer to your heat than it is out exposed in the yard. And so I would just focus on what you may need for your foundation. A lot of times over the winter in North Texas, we get sufficient rainfall that this is less of a concern, but we do have exceptions to this. Last year we had a period of time where things got a little concerning, maybe related to how dry it got. But I would just, if the focus is on foundation, I would seek resources, information from professional engineers on that topic that are familiar with our unique soil types here and can really speak to some of that. So, one thing I would say is, just because you're turning off the automated feature on your irrigation system or your sprinkler system does not mean that you can't water. If we have some years that we warm back up and have fairly warm periods of time in October or November. And we may desire that we may feel that we need to turn that irrigation system on manually in order to keep things healthy and make sure that, our biggest concern in the winter months is going to be less about giving turf water to prevent wilt. And it's going to be more about making sure that the soil stays, not too dry to prevent desiccation. But the Water My Yard program, which North Texas Municipal is a partner with, that program continues to be beneficial throughout the year in providing recommendations for what should be done. And if they feel that you need to irrigate at some point during these cooler months, based on the climate data, they're going to provide that recommendation. So I would just keep an eye on that. And typically what I tell people is between the months of about October and April, sometimes even as late as June, because we sometimes get very wet Mays here. in North Texas, we really do not need to have any automated irrigation turned on. It's always very difficult for me to see people continue to water twice a week or 3 times per week during those winter months, because not only is it wasteful, but it can also be very detrimental to the health of your turf grass. That turf grass can't take that water up, so it just causes things to sit there. I had a neighborhood in Fort Worth a few years ago that they had somebody, landscaper working in that neighborhood, was recommending that people continue to water twice per week all winter. And, it wasn't truly a disease issue that we saw. We saw lawns literally rotting, dormant lawns that were just kept too wet during that period of time, that started to rot away. So just no need for this. And then you can turn your water back on or set your automated program back up as we get warmer and drier again next summer. And all of this is because we see reduced evapotranspiration. So if you're not familiar with this term evapotranspiration, it's a combination of 2 main words. The first word being evaporation, which most of you are familiar with, and this is going to be water loss from the soil and the surrounding surfaces. And the second is transpiration, which is water loss from plants. This is water lost as vapor. It's something every plant does as a way of cooling itself. And we're going to see that the same things that kind of drive us to sweat, for example, are going to drive plants to transpire. And as they get into these winter months and they're not as physiologically active and they're not growing as much, they just are not transpiring at the same rate. We also don't see that evaporation's happening at the same rate because it's cooler and tends to be a little bit wetter. And so there's just genuinely not a need to provide that same level of irrigation or that same level of water during that time period. All right, so next practice is going to be fertilization. This is where we do tend to get some confusion, especially if we're looking at resources that are focused on cool season grasses up north, because you'll see a lot of recommendations for winterizing fertilizer applications. This is not something that we typically need to worry about too much with our warm season turf grass lawns. Typically, the only thing that we want to try to do at the end of the season, and I'll just preface this by saying that we're already too late to do this year. But the main thing that we want to focus on as we get to the end of the summer is we want to determine, are there any nutrient deficiencies that may be happening? And I'll talk about soil testing as a practice here in a minute. And we want to resolve those nutrient deficiencies before we go into the winter time. And so that's really the only goal here. Main deficiencies we may be concerned with is we want to make sure that there's not a phosphorus deficiency. We want to make sure that there's not a potassium deficiency, as both of these things can impact how easily or how well that lawn survives those winter months. Now, nitrogen in particular, which is in most of our fertilizer products that we would just go buy off the shelf at a big box store. Nitrogen is essentially responsible for promoting above ground leafy green growth. Okay, so it is a great nutrient to put out in those summer months when our turf grass is actively growing, especially early in the growing season, to really get that lush green growth. We want to make sure that we do it judiciously. We don't want to over apply nitrogen, can have a lot of potential issues there. But one thing we want to be really mindful of this time of year is that when we apply nitrogen too late in the season, it can cause a couple of problems to happen with our turf grass. The first is that it's encouraging too much above ground leafy green growth when that plant should really be preparing for winter, meaning it's moving its carbohydrates and it's moving its energy into storage below ground. When we encourage too much of that above ground growth, we're undermining the plant's natural ability to prepare for seasonal change. And then if we happen to get an early frost, like we did this year, the plant is more vulnerable to winter injury and damage because it is so succulent, and that tissue is so soft and fleshy because we fed it a bunch of nutrients to encourage that. And now we're going to see that, when that cold temperature hits, that plant tissue is so soft and so vulnerable that that winter injury is a lot more likely. We saw really great examples of this when we had Winter Storm Uri a couple of years ago. A lot of our sod farms in the state of Texas that were hit the hardest by that winter storm were further south. And it's because that grass had already started to green back up for the year and was starting to come out of dormancy and was particularly susceptible to injury, which compared to some of our northern farms, many of those grasses were still largely dormant or semi-dormant. They were in a good position to tolerate some of that. So, like I said, we're already past the window to make final fertilizer applications this year on warm season lawns. So if you have Bermuda or St. Augustine or Soja or buffalo grass lawns, it's too late to make any fertilizer applications this year. You'll have to wait until next spring. But in future years, typically what we want to aim for is to make that final fertilizer application about 6 weeks before the historic first frost date. And here's some examples of what can happen if we apply a little bit too late. And so, again, winter injury disease can sometimes become more likely if we make nitrogen applications too late in the year, because that turf grass is not typically going to be able to take up as much of that nitrogen later in the season. We also see an increased likelihood that we're going to be fertilizing more weeds than turf grass. And we'll also see likelihood that those nutrients may leave our property because the turf is not active enough to take them up. And this can contribute to nutrient pollution in our surface water, so streams and ponds and things like that. So, for us here in North Texas, on an average year, didn't happen this year. On an average year, we might anticipate that our first fall frost may be in late November, right around Thanksgiving. And so if we were thinking about 6 weeks before that, typically we're looking at making our absolute final fertilizer application here in North Texas around October 11th. Now, it can be a little bit before that. Sometimes I tell folks Labor Day is not a bad time. You can do your fertilizer applications around the major holidays over the growing season. So Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Labor Day. It's going to vary from year to year based on whether or not we're in a drought. We don't recommend making these fertilizer applications in a drought. And it's going to vary too, depending on what the potential for an early frost. So this year, had I made my application, final application October 11th, I might have seen some injury because of some of this early cold weather that we got. So, this date is going to vary depending on where you are in Texas, and it's going to vary from year to year. Unfortunately, Texas is very temperamental. We're not going to see a lot of consistency sometimes in what some of this weather is going to look like from year to year. But just try to avoid doing anything too late in the season. And hopefully you'll be able to keep from having too many issues. And then if you're curious when you should fertilize in the spring for the first time, we typically recommend that you wait until you've mowed your turf grass. So not the winter weeds, but the true turf grass twice. This is an indication that your turf grass is awake. It's actively growing for the year and it's ready to take up that fertilizer. We typically do not want to put out fertilizer before that. Sometimes we get some confusion. We get folks that purchase a weed and feed product to put out their pre-emergent in the spring, and they end up putting fertilizer out in February. A lot of that product is just going to feed weeds, or it's going to run off and cause environmental problems. And so it's not helping your turf grass at all, particularly for that quick release, those quick release fertilizer products that we see a lot of times in the box store. So wait until your grass has been mowed twice next spring, and then you can start to make your first fertilizer applications for the year. When it comes to fertilizing appropriately, we definitely recommend that you fertilize based on soil testing. This just allows you to customize your fertilizer program to your specific soils in your yard. For example, we very often see that in North Texas, we may very, very rarely actually need to apply phosphorus. And so, just going to the store and buying a complete fertilizer that has nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in it just by default, we may be over applying things that we don't need. And so, you can test your soil anytime, spring or late summer, early fall are good times. Just try to be consistent from year to year. We typically recommend that you do a soil test about every 1 to 3 years. Just to kind of keep an eye on what your nutrient levels look like. And if you do it in the later summer, around September, it allows you to see, are there any nutrient deficiencies before I go into the winter that I need to be mindful of? Do I need to make a potassium application or a phosphorus application before my plant starts to get ready for those winter months? And it gives you time to make that before we hit that historic, that 6 weeks before that historic frost date. When you're sampling soil, I assume many of you on here probably live in Collin County. If you're in other counties, we have 250 of the 254 counties in the state of Texas have an AgriLife Extension office. There's a county office that offers support for agricultural related issues, including issues related to lawns and gardens. And you can typically go by those county extension offices. The one in Collin County, for example, is up in McKinney. And you could get soil testing bags, you can get soil testing forms, and you can go out and collect some soil from your yard. Typically about a 6-inch depth is going to be ideal. And you're going to want multiple samples across the yard that you then combine so you can get a good average. And you will then ship that to our soil testing lab in College Station. And they'll generate a report for you with recommendations as to what your nutrient needs may be. So go to your county office if you've never been there, and they'll be able to provide you some help. You can also check out our soil testing lab website. It's just soiltesting.tamu.edu. All right, this time of year, it's also good to be mindful of the potential for late season mechanical injury. So any physical injury that happens to our lawn this time of year, it'll be very difficult for that lawn to recover properly before we have cold enough temperatures to cause damage. So one of the first things to think about here is that we definitely want to avoid scalping or mowing the turf grass too low this time of year. Sometimes folks get a little bit confused about this because they hear about transition season scalping, which is a practice that we sometimes do in the spring. And even that can be a little bit controversial, the science around it. There's some disputes as to how beneficial that is and versus the risk associated with it sometimes. But certainly this time of year, your yard, should probably be at the tallest point that it's been for the season. So typically, in my yard, I'm looking out at it right now. I've got a St. Augustine grass lawn. Typically at the beginning of the summer, that's going to be my lowest mowing height. I've removed debris from the previous year. I don't want to scalp St. Augustine too much because it can't tolerate it as well as Bermuda and Zoysia. So I want to be careful there. Typically, I start the season at about a 3-inch mowing height. And by the time I get to this time of the year, I'm looking at about 4 to 5 inches for St. Augustine grass. That's just a very coarse grass. It does really well at a tall height. And I'm going to leave it like that until next spring. I am not going to scalp it right now because my grass is not fully dormant. And while it's at that taller height, what I'm going to see is below ground deeper roots that correspond to that tall height. So the taller our mowing height is, the deeper our roots are typically. And those longer roots or those deeper roots are going to help me survive winter temperatures. And I do not want to take away from that by going out and mowing too short or scalping at this point in the season. So whatever your mowing height's at now, if you still have to get out there, do some light trimming for some areas that are still growing a little bit, just be sure that you never remove more than about 30% of that total leafy green height in a single mowing. Just try to keep that as much of that height on there as possible and avoid scalping or stressing that turf. Next spring, as the turf gets closer to greening up for the season, you can go in there and do a little bit shorter mowing to remove some of that debris. But we typically do not want to do that in the fall months. We really want to try to just let it stay tall, keep those deep roots. Similarly, this is not a good time of year to aerify or do any other types of cultivation. We're too late in the season. Those are mechanical injury that we need to focus on doing in the late spring, early summer when the turf grass is growing and can actively recover from that. If I went out and tried to aerate right now, in my yard, it would not be able to recover most likely before we get our next frost. And it's just not growing actively enough to tolerate that. And I can really do some damage and increase winter injury by doing that. Wintertime is also a great time to think about your equipment maintenance. So, to keep our turf grass healthy and happy, we want to make sure that we have good, sharp mower blades, that all of our equipment is clean. And wintertime is a great time to make sure that those blades get sharpened. It's a great time to clean some of that equipment off so that when we're getting ready to go out next spring, it's ready to go and ready to help us support a healthy lawn. This time of year, you've probably noticed we've got some of our summer weeds kind of lingering. They've produced some seed heads. Many of them got knocked down by some of those colder temperatures we had recently, but we may still see some of those seed heads out. A lot of us up here in North Texas have Dallas grass in our yard or crabgrass in our yard, and they produce seed at the end of the growing season for the next spring. And so this is a great time of year that if you are still doing some mowing, particularly if you see weeds in your yard, particularly if you see weeds with flowers or seed heads in your yard, this is a good time of year to bag and remove those clippings, just to remove that seed from your yard. This is going to hopefully help reduce the amount of weeds that germinate next year. Normally we recommend mulching clippings, because this can help us recycle nitrogen. We get some good benefits from doing that when we're following good mowing practices. But during transition seasons, when weeds that are in our yard are producing that seed and may drop that seed during mowing, the more of that we can collect and physically remove, the better. It's just going to set us up, hopefully, to have some reduced weed pressure. The other thing that happens this time of year is winter annual weeds begin to germinate. So this is a photo I took a couple of years ago from some research plots that I had in College Station when I was living there. And you can see all of these little winter annual weeds. These are all weeds that are germinating and emerging, in this turf grass plot area. Typically what we recommend for combating some of these annual weeds in particular, those are weeds that complete their life cycle in a single growing season, is a pre-emergence herbicide application in the fall. Now, we're a little late to make that application this year and have it be truly effective. But if you have not put anything out yet and you still want to put something out, you can do that. And you may still see some benefit, because we see that some weeds come up later in the winter than others. So while you may not get every small weed that started to come up, you may get those that germinate a little later in the season and still have some prevention there. And here in a minute, I'll kind of show you what we normally recommend for timing for this. But one thing I wanted to say is that, many people are familiar with the term pre-emergent or pre-emergence herbicide. Yet, unfortunately, a lot of times when we go to the big box stores, we may not see that products are labeled that way, and it can make it difficult to determine, where is the pre-emergent herbicide at this store. And that's because a lot of these products for the big box stores are actually labeled as something called a weed preventer or a crabgrass preventer. So if you don't see the word pre-emergent or pre-emergence, you might instead look for the word preventer. And we actually have a fact sheet that's available through AgriLife Learn that provides a little bit more guidance on this. And typically what we recommend, if you're willing to use herbicides and you know that you have some issues with certain annual weeds, whether they're summer annual weeds or winter annual weeds, pre-emergence herbicides can be extremely effective at slowing some of those weeds down, We often see that for some of the annual weeds that we get in our yards here in Texas, I'll use crabgrass as an example. We have very, very few options that are effective at controlling crabgrass in the yard after it's come up. So the more we can get ahead of it and prevent it from emerging in the first place, the better off we're going to be. In the winter time, we're very likely to see things like rescue grass, Poa annua or annual bluegrass, henbit. These are all winter annual weeds that come up in the fall and they grow through those winter months all the way into next spring. And so, typically to combat these, we recommend a two-pronged approach. This is 2 pre-emergent herbicide applications a year, one in the spring and one in the fall. And we typically base our timing on soil temperatures, right? Weeds do not have a little calendar that they keep with them underground to know what date to come up. They are going to respond to soil temperature and soil moisture. And so typically in the spring, we recommend that pre-emergent applications are made when soil temperatures reach around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Now you can buy a soil thermometer online. You can use a kitchen thermometer if it goes low enough. You can also just keep an eye on ambient temperature. So typically we'll see soil temperatures around 55 in the spring when our ambient temperatures are between 60 and 65. Okay. And so for us in North Texas, very often the best time to make a pre-emergent application in the spring is about the 3rd week of February. Okay. Now that can vary again from year to year. And then for us in the fall, we want to make those applications typically when soil temperatures drop to about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which tends to be about the 3rd week of September. Again, can vary from year to year. All right. And again, if we miss that window, we can still make potentially a little bit later application. Just make sure that you follow the label. You don't over apply these products, just like with any pesticide product or really any product we use in the lawn and garden. You can definitely always have too much of a good thing. And if we over apply these pre-emergent herbicides, they can create issues for us in the yard. So be judicious, follow the label, make sure you're keeping an eye on those rates. But it can be very helpful in slowing down some of those weeds. The fact sheet that we have available through AgriLife Learn has a list of some of the more common active ingredients that we see, particularly in box store products, so products that a homeowner can go buy fairly easily. It'll tell you what is that active ingredient, what types of weeds is it generally effective on, what kinds of products could we find it in, and some additional notes about that. So when you are shopping at the box store and you're looking at a product and you're going, is this a pre-emergent? You'll be able to look at the list of ingredients, compare it to the fact sheet, and see whether or not it has one of these ingredients in there and what that ingredient will really do. Now, as winter weeds are coming up this time of year, we want to try to control them as we see them emerge. So, keep an eye out for them. It can be really easy sometimes to ignore some of these weeds when they're really small. And then all of a sudden it's spring, they're very large and they're extremely difficult to control and causing a lot of problems. And a lot of times we may see winter weeds can be especially problematic because they compete with our turf grass in the spring when the turf grass is trying to green back up and become healthy and fill in again, and those weeds interfere with that process and can create challenges for us. So keeping an eye on these weeds emerging now and trying to control them, even if control means you're pulling them by hand as they come up and they're small, can really help you in the long run to keep those weeds from being really problematic in a few months. Now, we do see some diseases that get really active this time of year. The main one that we really worry about in our lawns here in North Texas is called large patch disease. You may have heard the term brown patch before. That term is a dated term that we no longer use to describe this pathogen in warm season lawns. The correct term is large patch now. Brown patch is going to refer to a different version of that pathogen that primarily targets cool season lawns. And so if you were to, for example, look up control recommendations for quote brown patch, you may get some things that are not accurate or not the best practices to control that disease, because it's really referring to something slightly different. So you want to look up resources to help manage large patch disease. This is a disease that has the greatest economic impact on zoysia lawns and St. Augustine grass lawns. It will sometimes show up in Bermuda lawns or even buffalo lawns, but it's just a little bit less likely for us to see that disease in those lawns. We will typically start to see symptoms of this disease really in late summer, early fall, sometimes when temperatures are still as warm as about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And these symptoms may not be immediately very visible to us. A lot of times we may really not see the full impact or the full damage of this disease until next spring. So a lot of times I'll get calls about this in the spring from people that their lawn has started to green up. They have big circular patches in that lawn, and they want to know what to do to control that disease. And unfortunately, a lot of times by the time the rest of the yard is greened back up, we've warmed up a lot, and that disease seems the most visible. The pathogen itself is not very active anymore, and those fungicides are not effective. Really what you're seeing is damage that began in the fall and took place over the course of the winter and early spring. And so for this disease, if we know we have a history of dealing with it on our property, we want to use preventative fungicides. Now, I don't typically recommend using fungicides. If you've never had this disease, you don't even know what I'm talking about, please do not go out and buy a fungicide product. We never want to use pesticides that we really don't feel we need to use. But if you're like, I've had issues with this disease every year in my yard, and I put out a fungicide every spring and it does nothing, it's because the timing for that fungicide application is not quite right. It needs to be typically applied in the fall, typically when our, around the same time the pre-emergent gets applied. Typically when those soil temperatures get to about 80 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. In particular, you might want to target if you've got low-lying areas or areas with poor drainage in your landscape. Those areas tend to be more vulnerable. We'll also see that disease is more likely in very wet years. We're not having a very wet fall so far this year, so I'm not as concerned. But in past years, we may get rain all September and all October, and those are going to be years that we're very likely to see issues with this disease. And so just keep an eye on it. If you've had this issue before, you can make a preventative application right now if you want to, and it may be helpful in preventing this disease from being an issue for you this year. But if you've never had this challenge before, just don't worry about it. This is really just targeted at people that know that they've got some trouble with this. The other thing we might see, although I think we're past the window that I was really concerned about with this year, is sometimes in the late summer, early fall, we'll see certain insects really flare up in the yard, and a fall armyworm is one example of this. It gets its name because it tends to be active in the fall, but more and more I would say that we see that this insect can be active pretty much all growing season. What I would say is that, in future years, we tend to see this we tend to see like big epidemic issues with this, where if there's going to be an armyworm problem, everyone's going to know that there's an armyworm problem. It won't necessarily just be your unique little yard that has this issue. It's going to be an issue that's visible across many yards. Younger, less established lawns will be more susceptible than older, more established lawns typically. So just keep an eye out. They're leaf feeding insects. It's typically not a mystery when they're out there. You'll start to see that damage. They have a very clear line that they kind of march as they move across that yard, and just go out, look for them. Sometimes they hide a little bit in that turf, but you should be able to see them in there. And they've got pretty distinctive features. They have a Y feature on their face that you see here. They've got this kind of camo color because they're in the Army. And they have these long stripes that run the length of either side of their body, and these 4 little black dots that show up on their little booty. Okay. And if you're ever not sure, send a picture to your county extension agent. That will be Brad Voss. He's doing one of the next webinars as part of this series. So send a picture to him. make sure, especially, I mean, anytime you're using a pesticide, make sure you know for sure what pest you're using it for and that you're applying that product at the right time and that it's the right product. Unfortunately, it's really easy to make inappropriate applications. These pesticides are so easy to access. And we don't want to apply an insecticide that we don't need because it can harm other life, and it puts us at risk putting that product out unnecessarily. So we want to make sure that we know for sure, that we're using the right product, that we're controlling the properly identified pest, and we're using it at the right time. Couple things I wanted to mention because we are focused on water. I've just talked a little bit about different pesticides that folks may use. Very easy for us to have issues with what we call off-target movement of pesticides. This means that we put a pesticide out and the goal is that we're trying to get it in contact with that pest. And for whatever reason, due to a series of factors, it leaves where that pest is and it goes somewhere we don't intend for it to go. So, I'll give you the example that's probably the easiest, which is many of our herbicide applications. If we make those applications under the wrong conditions or with the wrong equipment or whatever it is, that herbicide may drift or run off or move somewhere we did not intend for it to and cause damage to other plants or end up in our watershed. And so, anytime you're using a pesticide product, even if it feels like you can be very casual because it's just a jug of something you got at the box store and it doesn't feel like a big deal, please always make sure you take time to read and follow the label. This is true for organic products as well. This is something I always have to hammer home for people because we see, people get a little too casual sometimes with an organic pesticide. If it's a pesticide, it's designed to kill or control something, which means it has the potential to do harm. That's the whole purpose of it. And we see that with some of these, herbicides, for example, that are, quote, natural or organic, they have the highest risk signal word from the EPA, the highest risk of acute toxicity to humans. Some of these very concentrated forms of vinegar, they can burn your skin and blind you and eat through concrete. And so that's not to say don't use them, but just because a product's organic doesn't mean it should not be treated with a lot of respect and caution. Please protect yourself, read the label. Here in Texas, I never recommend that you use rainfall to water in a product. We do not get that kind of rainfall here, and we do not have those types of soils. We're just too prone to runoff events and flooding events. And so, to really do right by a product and apply it properly, I generally recommend that you use irrigation where you can really be in control. I've just seen too many cases, unfortunately, where somebody sets out with good intentions, they put a product out hoping to use the rain to water it in, and then the next thing you know, we get 7 inches of rain in 4 hours, and that product leaves the property entirely. So now I've wasted my time and my money, and that product ends up in our streams and rivers and lakes. Avoid making a herbicide or other pesticide applications under saturated soil conditions. This can be especially important in the fall because we do tend to get some really heavy rainfall in the fall and the winter a lot of times. If we get 2 more inches of rain tomorrow, which we might, please do not go out right after that and put out a fungicide or put out a herbicide, because the ground is not going to be able to receive that product. And we actually see that with some of these products, herbicides are a great example. Some of the pre-emergent herbicides, if I apply that to a soil that has no oxygen in it because it's full of water, that product may only really last me for about 10 days. Whereas if I apply it under appropriate conditions, that product may last, 2 or 3 months and provide that barrier for my weeds. And so applying these products when the soil is saturated, very wet, can definitely create some issues. It increases the likelihood too that product is going to run off. and again, go into our watershed. And then the last thing I would just say is anytime you use a pesticide product, please take time to dispose of excess products and containers properly. Many of our cities around here, we're very fortunate. We live in a major metropolitan area, and many of our cities, as well as many of our water providers, and Helen may be able to speak to whether or not North Texas has a program for this, have programs set up for curbside pickup or drop off for disposal of some of these household chemical and pesticide products. And so just look into what resources are available to you in your city and your county. And anytime you have excess products like that, just please don't pour them down the drain or even pour them just into your yard. Please take the time to arrange to have those disposed of properly. I work around the entire state of Texas, and there's many parts of Texas that don't have those resources. They have to wait every few years for the city to be able to afford to pay to have somebody come in and help with disposal of those things. So we're very lucky up here that we have so many great opportunities to dispose of these things properly. So please take advantage of that. And that's what I've got. We've got a little time here for some questions.
All right, thank you, Becky. I think that was probably the most detail and answered every single question I had. Presentation I've heard. I was wondering about the scalping. I was wondering about the pre-emergent. I was wondering about weed and feed, like, is that a good product or not? And you touched on all of that. So if our guests have any questions, if you want to unmute and ask them directly to Becky, you're more than welcome to. And Kathy from Dallas, do you have a question? Okay, let me see if I can unmute you, okay? All right, so you should get a little request to unmute and you'll have to say yes.
Okay. My question is about, we noticed a couple of weeks ago that there was all this sticky aphid honeydew stuff all over. Is that permanently damaging to lawns or anything like that?
Typically, no. Do you guys have crepe myrtles?
Some. We do.
Yes, so it's probably coming from your crepe myrtles. So we have significant issues with something called crepe myrtle bark scale. Almost every crepe myrtle in North Texas has it. Mine have it out in my front yard. They cause a lot of honeydew issues, and it tends to drop down, blow around, and get all over the yard. But typically it doesn't create a lot of issues for us. Every once in a while up north on the cool season grasses, they'll get something called like black sooty mold from too much of that honeydew accumulating. But I've never seen really significant issues here impacting our turf. And anytime you're concerned about it, you can take a hose out, especially if it's right under the tree, take a hose out and just kind of hose those leaves off. But I've never seen any long-term damage associated with that honeydew. But that's a really great question.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So Becky, we had a question from Robin about suggestions for pecan dieback due to the summer drought.
Yeah, so I see a couple little things here. So she's got, so she said that honeydew this year is coming from aphids on pecan. Yeah, I think we had more insect issues this year on plants in general, I think because of our extreme weather than I have seen in years. Insects that I never normally see or certainly don't see in these numbers. And so it doesn't surprise me to hear, I don't have a pecan in my yard, so I probably just didn't notice that. I just noticed my crepe myrtle issues, but doesn't surprise me to hear that. Again, I'm not too worried about it creating long-term issues with the turf, and some of this rain too that we're getting should help to kind of flush some of these things out of the yard. So great question about St. Augustine dieback due to the summer drought. I've got some patches in my yard. I would say St. Augustine was the hardest hit by the drought this year. What I would say is, there's nothing to be done about it until next spring. You have a couple of different options. The first is to just wait it out and see how much of it may start to recover on its own once we get ideal spring temperature conditions again. You can focus on making sure you have proper fertility to encourage growth and recovery. The other thing that I would do, especially in the spring, is I would skip a herbicide application in any of those areas where you suspect you had significant injury, because those herbicides, especially the pre-emergents, they're really intended for healthy turf. And if you put them on a patch, I've got probably about an 8 by 10 patch in my yard right now that I'm not going to put any pre-emergent on that this fall or next spring, because it might interfere with or slow down recovery of that area. You will potentially have weeds that come up in those spots. I would suggest just manually treating them to remove them. And then from there, you'll just have some tough decisions to make. If you're not seeing the recovery the way you want by, I would say, late May, early June, and you really want to get that area figured out, then you're probably going to be looking at buying some sod to patch that area. Or you can pull plugs from healthy areas in your yard. So like a 6-inch plug with roots and all, and you can actually plant that in those areas. It's slow. It's a slow process. It's not going to be as quick as full sodding that area. But I planted plugs on one side of my yard at the end of last year. And I would say over the course of this growing season, they did a pretty good job, even with our drought, of filling in a pretty significant portion of the yard. And so those are kind of your two options. I think it's still a little hard to tell exactly how damaged the St. Augustine is, because we still haven't had super great conditions to encourage it to recover. And now it's been cold. And so that's why I say, maybe just be patient, see how it looks early next spring. And then if you're not seeing good recovery by, like I said, early June, I would try to get something new planted before it gets too hot and too dry, if that's your goal.
All right. Thank you, Becky. Are there any other questions before we wrap up? All right. So just as a reminder, we have one more session in our fall series. It's going to be on November 18th with Brad Voss. He's going to be talking about planting trees and shrubs, because the winter is one of the best times to plant trees in North Texas. So that's going to be a really good one. You can find out more information and the link to register at NTMWD.com/classes. And on that website, you can also find links for the recording of this series and then all the other classes we've had. So it's a great little website to visit, ntmwd.com/classes for that kind of information. And just to go back to Becky's question about different cities that offer recycling for what we call household hazardous waste, things like leftover fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides, is the best thing to do is check with your city first. And also there is a website called timetorecycle.com that also can show you different places where you might be able to drop off some things, because some things that you might want to get rid of might have value to somebody else, and they could use those products too. So it's almost like a way to donate some of your things that you don't want anymore. So that's timetorecycle.com and also ntmwd.com/classes. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for everyone who shared their information for the toolkit giveaway. I will send the winner an email and then let them know how to claim their prize. So I hope to see everyone back on November 18th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy fall.